Did you know that over 90% of our audience watches our videos but hasn't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these stories and want to see more, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It only takes a second and it helps us create more amazing content for you. I never expected my life to take the turn that it did. If you had asked me a year ago, I would have told you that my marriage was fine. Not perfect, but steady. Daniel and I had been together for 8 years, married for 5. We had a comfortable routine, a nice home, and what I believe to be mutual respect. But as I look back now, I realize how much I had convinced myself that comfort meant happiness, that routine meant love. It all started when Daniel got a promotion at work. He had been with the company for years, working long hours, always striving for recognition. His boss, Nathan Caldwell, was the CEO of the firm, a man I had only heard about in passing. He was respected, powerful, and from what Daniel had told me, extremely demanding. I first met Nathan at a company event, a formal dinner celebrating the company's recent success. Daniel had insisted I come, even though I wasn't fond of corporate gatherings. I dressed up, put on a polite smile, and prepared myself for an evening of business talk and small talk with people I didn't know. Nathan was introduced to me early in the evening. He was older than I expected, probably in his late 40s, with a confidence that was almost intimidating. He wasn't overly charming or trying too hard. He didn't need to be. His presence was enough. He shook my hand firmly, held eye contact, and made me feel like I was the most important person in the room for those few seconds. "It's great to finally meet you," he said. "Daniel speaks highly of you." I smiled politely, not sure what to say. "Well, he speaks highly of you too." Nathan chuckled. "I'd hope so. I keep him busy enough." That night, I found myself watching him more than I should have. It wasn't attraction, not at first. It was curiosity. He had a way of controlling a room, of making people listen without demanding their attention. He didn't need to be the loudest voice. Throughout the evening, I caught his gaze more than once, and each time, he didn't look away quickly like most people would. It was just a second longer than necessary, a fleeting moment that felt heavier than it should have. I told myself I was imagining things. After the event, I didn't think much about him. Life went on as usual, but a few weeks later, Daniel mentioned that Nathan had invited us to a more intimate dinner, just a few executives and their spouses at his home. "I think he likes you," Daniel said with a grin. "He kept asking me about you after the event." That should have meant nothing. It should have been a passing comment, nothing more. But the way my stomach tightened at his words made me realize something deep inside me had shifted. The night of the dinner, I was more aware of Nathan than I should have been. His home was exactly what I expected: grand, modern, expensive, but tasteful. His wife, Allison, was lovely, the perfect hostess. She was effortlessly beautiful, composed, and she carried herself with the same quiet confidence as her husband. The evening was pleasant, but there were moments, little moments, where I felt Nathan's attention linger. He asked me questions, listened carefully, responded in ways that felt more personal than necessary. And every time our eyes met, I felt something I couldn't quite name. After that night, I tried to push him from my mind. But the truth was, I started seeing him more often. Not intentionally, at least not at first. Daniel would mention that Nathan had invited us to another event, another dinner, another gathering. I told myself it was just socializing, just networking. But deep down, I knew I looked forward to seeing him again. The first time I realized I was in trouble was at a charity gala. It was a crowded event, and at one point, I found myself standing next to Nathan at the bar, away from the noise of the main hall. "You look like you could use a break," he said, handing me a glass of champagne. I laughed. "Is it that obvious?" "A little." He leaned slightly toward me, not in an inappropriate way, but just enough that I noticed. "You don't like these events, do you?" "They're fine," I said with a small shrug. He studied me for a moment before saying, "You're not like the others." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head, considering his words. "Most people in this circle play the same game. They want something: connections, status, recognition. But you don't seem like you're trying to impress anyone." I wasn't sure how to respond to that. The way he said it made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. "I guess I don't feel the need to," I finally said. He smiled, but there was something else in his expression, something that made my pulse quicken. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about him, and from that moment on, things changed. At first, it was subtle, an extra moment of conversation when we crossed paths. A glance held just a second too long. A text message from Daniel saying Nathan had invited us somewhere, and feeling my heart race before I could stop myself. I knew it was dangerous. I knew I should pull away before it became something more. But the truth was, I didn't want to, and that scared me more than anything. I told myself it was nothing. Just a harmless curiosity, an innocent thrill of attention that didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew better. I had never been the kind of person who sought out danger, who played with fire just to see how close I could get before being burned. Yet, with Nathan, every interaction felt like a slow step towards something I wasn't sure I wanted, but couldn't seem to avoid. The real shift happened on a Friday afternoon when Daniel called me, sounding irritated. "Nathan wants me to stay late to finish up this project. I'll probably be home past midnight." He was frustrated, but I barely registered the words. All I heard was Nathan's name. All I felt was the sudden jolt in my stomach that I didn't want to acknowledge. "Okay," I said, keeping my voice even. "Don't work too hard." I hung up, staring at my reflection in the hallway mirror. What was wrong with me? My husband working late shouldn't have made me feel anything other than mild annoyance or sympathy. Instead, I felt restless, like something was shifting in a way I didn't understand. Later that evening, just as I was settling into the couch with a book, my phone buzzed. I picked it up, expecting a message from Daniel, but instead, it was a number I didn't recognize. "Nathan, are you free?" I sat up straighter, my pulse quickening. "Me. Who is this?" A moment later, another message. "Nathan, I think you know." I swallowed hard, staring at the screen. This wasn't normal. This wasn't appropriate. I should have ignored it. Instead, I typed back, "Me. How did you get my number?" His response came almost instantly. "Nathan, I have my ways. Meet me for a drink. Just a conversation." A conversation. That's all it would be. There was nothing inherently wrong with that, right? People met for drinks all the time. Friends, colleagues, acquaintances. I wasn't doing anything wrong. At least, that's what I told myself as I grabbed my coat and keys. I met him at a quiet lounge, the kind of place tucked away enough that you wouldn't just stumble upon it. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a booth in the corner. He looked up when I walked in, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, as I slid into the seat across from him. "Neither was I admitted. He ordered us drinks, and for a while we talked about nothing, about work, about books, about places we had traveled. But underneath it all, there was an unspoken awareness, a tension neither of us acknowledged, but both felt. At one point, He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Can I ask you something?" I hesitated but nodded. "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out, because the truth was, I didn't know. I had spent so long telling myself that my marriage was fine, that my life was fine, that I had no right to complain. But sitting there, looking into Nathan's eyes, I realized that I hadn't felt truly alive in a long time. "You don't have to answer," he said after a moment. "I think I already know." I should have left then. I should have put an end to whatever this was becoming. But instead, I stayed. And that was my first real mistake. After that night, things escalated in ways I couldn't control. Nathan started texting me more often, sometimes small things, like asking how my day was. Other times, more pointed messages that made my stomach tighten. Nathan, thinking about our conversation last night, I enjoyed it. Nathan, you have a way of making people feel seen. I doubt you realize it. Nathan, I wish we could talk again. I knew I should have stopped responding. I knew this wasn't just friendly conversation anymore, but I didn't stop. Then came the night that changed everything. Daniel was out of town for a work conference, and I was home alone when my phone buzzed. Nathan, come outside. My breath caught. I hesitated, staring at the message, knowing what this meant. Knowing that if I stepped outside, I was making a choice I couldn't take back. And yet I stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked out the door. Nathan was leaning against his car, hands in his pockets, watching me with an intensity that made my heart pound. "I shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "Then why are you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step toward me, his expression unreadable. "Because I can't stop thinking about you." The words hung between us, heavy and undeniable. I should have told him to leave. I should have turned around and gone back inside. But instead, I stayed. And that was my second mistake. That night, standing outside my house with Nathan, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff. One step forward, and I would fall into something I couldn't undo. One step back, and I could pretend none of this had ever happened. I wish I could say I was strong enough to walk away. "I don't know what we're doing," I whispered. Nathan exhaled, looking at me like he was searching for the right words. "Neither do I." The weight of what we were risking pressed against me. My marriage, his career, our reputations. And yet, none of it seemed to matter in that moment as much as the way he looked at me. Like I was something more than just Daniel's wife, more than just a woman going through the motions of a life she was supposed to be satisfied with. I thought he would reach for me. I thought I would let him. But instead, he took a slow step back. "I should go." I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah." For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, without another word, he turned and walked to his car. I stood there, watching his taillights disappear into the night, feeling a mix of relief and something else, something dangerously close to disappointment. But it wasn't over. After that night, Nathan and I kept finding excuses to talk. A text here, a chance encounter there. We never crossed the line, but we hovered so close to it that the line blurred. Then, one afternoon, everything unraveled. Daniel had left his phone on the kitchen counter before heading to the store. I wasn't the kind of wife who snooped, but when his screen lit up with a notification, I saw a name I didn't expect. Nathan. My stomach dropped. I hesitated, then reached for the phone, my fingers trembling. The message was simple. "Nathan, we need to talk." Panic surged through me. I grabbed my own phone and texted Nathan immediately. Me. "Why are you messaging Daniel?" His response was almost instant. Nathan, meet me. I left the house without thinking, without telling Daniel where I was going. I drove straight to Nathan's office, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I arrived, he was already waiting for me outside. The moment I got out of the car, I demanded, "What's going on?" Nathan's expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "Daniel knows something's off." My heart pounded. "What do you mean?" "He's been asking questions. He thinks I've been acting strange. He doesn't suspect us, but he knows something isn't right." A cold wave of fear washed over me. This had all been a game of careful balance, a dangerous dance we thought we could control. But we had been wrong. "We have to stop this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Nathan nodded. "I know." It was the only choice we had. That night, when Daniel came home, I tried to pretend everything was normal. I asked about his day. I laughed at his jokes. I acted like the wife I was supposed to be. But something had shifted. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the realization that I had almost thrown everything away for something that could never have lasted. Whatever it was, I knew I had come too close to ruining my marriage. Over the next few weeks, I distanced myself from Nathan. The texts stopped. The lingering glances faded. And slowly, painfully, I started focusing on my marriage again. Daniel never found out the full truth. Maybe he suspected something. Maybe he just chalked it up to stress. Either way, I never gave him a reason to push further. And Nathan, we became strangers again. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we had taken that final step, if I had let myself fall. But I also know that some lines, once crossed, can never be undone. I almost lost everything, but almost was enough to remind me of what truly mattered. Life moved forward, as it always does. The tension that had once consumed me slowly faded, replaced by the quiet realization of what I had almost lost. I poured myself back into my marriage, not because of guilt, but because I wanted to, because I needed to. I started paying attention to the things I had once ignored, the small details about Daniel that had become background noise in our daily routine. The way he always left the last sip of coffee for me in the mornings. The way he absent-mindedly reached for my hand when we walked side by side. The way he looked at me, even after all these years, with a quiet kind of love I had taken for granted. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a show we had both seen 100 times, Daniel turned to me suddenly. "You've been different lately," he said, studying my face. I froze for a moment, my heart pounding. "Different how?" "I don't know," he admitted. "More present. More here." I swallowed hard, nodding. "I guess I've just been thinking a lot." "About what?" I hesitated, then offered him the most honest answer I could without shattering everything. "About us. About how easy it is to forget how much we matter to each other." He smiled softly, reaching for my hand. "We do matter." I held onto him a little tighter, feeling the weight of everything I hadn't said, everything I never would. As for Nathan, he remained a distant presence in my life. I saw him at company events, exchanged polite smiles, but we both knew. There was no need for words. The story we had almost written had ended before it could begin. And maybe that was for the best, because sometimes the most dangerous temptations are the ones that force us to confront who we really are. And I had finally found my way back to myself.